Good evening. We have to talk about the events this past weekend, the shootings. This is terrible, in Dayton and in El Paso. I'm not identitarian. I don't go around calling names, calling people names, and I don't go around saying who is the enemy and who isn't. I just don't think that way. I'm an individual, but I do very much feel in the middle of this because of the way I blog and the way I work. So I just wanted to make some observations. First of all, the most obvious thing is gun control. And yes, I would support, I would support reasonable, regulations like having to do with assault weapons and closing loopholes and background checks, and it seems like Congress hasn't been willing to do that, and that needs to change. But I don't think that that's going to be enough. I don't think that that's going to make a whole lot of difference because there's so many guns in circulation, and we should do that. And I agree with David Hogg. We should do that. Most of his proposals are actually reasonable, but I don't know if that's really the problem. I think the real problem is radicalization. It's also true that radicalization, and we're going to talk about the internet, but it's true that if you went back in the 70s, and here's a tweet about gun violence that interrupted, but anyway, if you go back to the 70s, there was a lot of violence. There was the Symbionese Liberation Army, there was the Weathermen and everything before the internet, and even when things moved slower, there was some very determined violence. It was very Maoist driven and very collectivist. So it's not all even the internet, but that's what's different now. The extreme right is a little harder to define where the boundaries of acceptable speech are than it is maybe on the left, because of the past associations and because it has to do with excluding groups and everything. And because it's woven into conservatism, it's very hard to separate it out. It was easier to separate radical Islam and even separate it from the rest of Islam, from the rest of the Muslim world, than it is the alt-right and white supremacy from regular conservatism. So that's a real problem. But there's also the issue of where the radicalization takes place, which we think a lot of it is on 8chan and maybe 4chan. And it's because it's harder to define domestic terrorism than it is to define overseas terrorism. There's a possibility that you could use the fact that these the white identitarianism and supremacy of the past, going all the way back to the 80s, it has been a transnational group. So you probably could come up with some legal ways to treat it a bit like radical Islam if you wanted to. But it's also true, if you look at the sites like 8chan, and even though they don't moderate and they have Section 230 protecting them, when a site actually knows that not an ideology, but that an actual act is being planned, yes, if it doesn't do anything, it might be guilty of criminal complicity, even with existing law. But what I'm really against is actually planning actual acts. I personally think that you have to be willing to think about all ideologies and assume that the system of government is supposed to make the most extreme ideologies impossible to implement, that we're to the point that we can do that.